My name is Mark Nordenberg. I'm a former chancellor of the university, former dean of this law school, and currently am privileged to serve both as the chair of the Institute of Politics and director of the Dick Thornburgh Forum for Law and Public Policy. And it is in those two latter roles that I extend a welcome to all of you today. I extend that welcome not only for myself, but also for Samantha Balbier, who is the director of the Institute of Politics, and for two extraordinarily distinguished members of the Thornburgh family, Ginny Thornburgh, the former First Lady of Pennsylvania, and David Thornburgh, a son of Dick and Ginny, and one of the most effective and committed advocates for good governance in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I wondered who brought Phil Hallen in, David. So maybe I should say something to explain myself. While he was the CEO of the Committee of 70, a century-plus-old good governance group in Philadelphia, and the creator, really, of the Draw the Lines initiative, David did a great deal to elevate citizen interest in the process of redistricting. And now that he has shed his executive responsibilities, he seems entirely committed to leading Ballot Pennsylvania's efforts to repeal the laws that keep Pennsylvania's primaries closed. So just read the newspapers and you'll learn more about what David is doing these days. Dick Thornburgh, a graduate of this law school, had an extraordinary career. Among the important positions he held were United States Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania, Assistant U.S. Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division for the U.S. Department of Justice, two-term governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, United States Attorney General under both President Reagan and the first President Bush, and Undersecretary General of the United Nations. I think that Dick carried with him into those roles a commitment to good governance that was honed and hardened by his experiences as a leader. And the forum that bears his name regularly does present programs relating to governance. Some of them are general in nature. Recently, we have presented clusters of programs dealing with themes like governing in crisis and preserving democracy. We now have shifted a little bit and are talking about the processes of reshaping government and the possibilities and perils that we face through this work. Given Dick's own experience, it's not surprising that the first two programs of this academic year related to federal law enforcement and the ways it's changing, and also America's role in changing the world order. Today's program takes us in a somewhat different direction. However, because health is so important to the many roles that government can productively play, and also is so central to the work of this university, it seemed appropriate for the Thornburgh Forum to host a program that would involve both a celebration of the path-breaking work that was accomplished here under the leadership of Dr. Jonas Salk, and also to learn a bit more about vaccines generally. Of course, we needed to recruit new levels of expertise into our team to do a reasonable job at that. Don Burke and Peter Salk fortunately stepped forward, and the three of us have basically served as a planning committee for this program, and I'm deeply grateful to Peter and to Don for their many contributions. And much of the work of implementing the plans we were developing fell on the shoulders of Kim Carson, the program manager for the Thornburgh Forum, and Diane Martin, my executive assistant. And so I do want to publicly thank them from the outset as well. There is another direct link between the Thornburgh Forum and our celebration of the Salk polio vaccine. Dick and Ginny Thornburgh each earned international respect for the work that they did on behalf of the disabled community. In fact, as Attorney General, Dick was the point person in pushing forward the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act on behalf of the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush. And each year, the forum hosts a Thornburgh Family Lecture on Disability Law and Policy. Polio, of course, is a disease that marched cruelly through the population, creating large numbers of deaths and even larger numbers of disabilities. We have a number of elected officials with us today. I'm smiling and looking at Dan Frankel from the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, a longtime Pitt trustee and the chair of the House Committee on Health. I thought I might have seen Paul Klein, who is a Pitt faculty member and a member of the Allegheny County Council, walk in. I do know that his colleague, Council Member Bob Macy, is here today. And Bob has arrived with a special proclamation. So let me ask Councilmember Macy if he would come to the podium to make this presentation, and I'd like to ask Peter Salk to come up and join us at the podium as well.
Thank you, Mark Nordenberg. I come here for a reason to acknowledge the work that has been done by Dr. Jonas Salk and all of those people that have entered in and was part of that program. When I was a younger person, I lived out in the country of White Oak, and we had neighbors. You know, we all socialized. We run around like, you know, little kids do. And I do remember that I had a neighbor, Betsy Carr, who was part of the family of three, but I never saw her. And then one day, I saw her with leg braces, and I saw her with the arm braces that she used as canes to get around. And being a young person, I didn't know. One of the things I did know is I had to go get a shot one day, and it was the polio shot. And I still have that scar. But it's fading. With age, that stuff goes away. But I think it's important to know that a lot of the medical advances has been done right here. We have to be proud of our School of Medicine. We have to be proud of Pitt. I have several family members who graduated from here, and I have a daughter that's a nurse in obstetrics and gynecology. But the University of Pittsburgh is almost like family. So I just want to read the proclamation. I always need a little visual aid at my age. Whereas polio, a disease that affected humanity many times throughout recorded history, attacks the nervous system of mainly children and young adults that can cause varying degrees of paralysis of arms and legs, affect muscles of the respiratory system, throat, impairing speech, swallowing, and breathing. And whereas since the virus is easily transmitted, epidemics were commonplace in the first decades of the 20th century. The first major polio epidemic in the United States occurred in Vermont in the summer of 1894 and in 1952. The single worst wave of disease infected nearly 58,000 individuals in the United States, many of whom were left using walking aids to assist with balance and mobility and full-body breathing apparatuses called iron lungs in the aftermath of the surge. And whereas the first polio vaccine, which stands today, is one of the most significant milestones in modern medicine, which developed by Jonas Salk, MD, and his team of researchers at the University of Pittsburgh. Whereas between 1952 and 1954, in pilot trials, nearly 15,000 Pittsburgh and Allegheny County residents, mostly children, received the Salk polio vaccine by injection, thus paving the way for an unprecedented national trial. And whereas on April 12, 1955, virologists announced that they've developed a safe and potent vaccine against polio, the deadly, paralyzing disease that tormented thousands of individuals in the United States. Setting off a series of concentrated vaccination campaigns in the country and abroad, the announcement sowed the seeds for a polio-free future and has been called one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. And whereas one of the greatest challenges to mankind always has been eradicated the presence of debilitating diseases, the University of Pittsburgh is building on the legacy established 20 years ago by making the development of vaccines and drugs for viruses and other infections agents one of its top research priorities today. Now, therefore, be it resolved that we, Allegheny County Council, do here declare April 12, 2025 as Dr. Jonas E. Salk Day in Allegheny County. And we recognize the pioneering achievement of Dr. Salk and the members of his research team, appreciating to the family of Dr. Salk for the elimination of polio and their contributions to Jonas Salk legacy. Exhibit at Pitt Public Health, the pioneering volunteers who contributed to the development of the polio vaccine and to the world of public health. And we celebrate with the University of Pittsburgh on the 70th anniversary of the approval and use of the Salk polio vaccine. Thank you.
Well, those are words to remember, aren't they? People helping people. Just last month, Elena Konis, a historian of medicine and public health at the University of California, Berkeley, published a guest essay in the New York Times. It was titled, "We Need a Reminder of What the Pre-Vaccine Era Was Like." Early in that essay, Professor Konis said this: "The modern-day childhood vaccine schedule has allowed children to grow into healthy adults, something all parents hoped for in the centuries when diseases emptied towns, destroyed economies, ravaged battalions, overwhelmed hospitals, and vexed nurses and doctors. For people who've never seen them, the worst manifestations of those preventable diseases are almost unimaginable. It's worth remembering their toll." Though her essay also dealt with smallpox, diphtheria, pertussis, measles, mumps, and rubella, it opened with what has become a classic photograph of a young girl with polio meeting a boy of about the same age who had been among the first children to receive the polio vaccine. He's holding an emblem declaring himself to be a polio pioneer for 1954. According to the Journal of the American Medical Association, the first major outbreak of polio in the United States occurred in 1916, when 6,000 people died and 27,000 people were paralyzed. By the early 1950s, those numbers were dramatically higher. In the opening pages of his book, Splendid Solution, Jonas Salk and the Conquest of Polio, Jeffrey Kluwer conveyed a gripping sense of the life or death challenges faced by America's children, their parents, and the healthcare professionals caring for them. This is what he said. In the summer of 1952 alone, more than 55,000 children in the United States had gone to bed with what their mothers believed was a cold and woke up feverish, chilled, and rubber-limbed the next day. When the worried-looking doctor was led into the children's rooms, where they lay flat on their clammy backs beneath their wilted sheets, he'd ask them, almost casually, if they wouldn't mind lifting up their heads to look at their belly buttons. When they couldn't do it, it was as sure a sign as any that the cold actually was poliomyelitis and that their rubbery limbs would soon grow worse. The following summer, another 35,000 children went to bed sick and failed the belly button test and were hurried off to hospitals where they waited to learn if the virus would quit when it had claimed their legs or if it would also go after their arms and their torsos and their breath as well. Now it was April 1954, and the fast-warming spring weather was as sure a reminder as any that the polio season was again approaching, following the heat from south to north, picking off children as it went, like shot hitting skeet. It was against this onrushing danger that Salk had been racing. The April 12, 1955 announcement that Dr. Salk and his pit team had won that race was greeted with such headlines as polio conquered, polio routed, the development of the vaccine, as Councilmember Macy indicated, almost immediately was recognized as one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century, a distinction that it has retained over the course of the subsequent decades. When we gathered at Pitt 2 decades ago to celebrate the 50th anniversary of that historic April 12th announcement that the Salk vaccine was safe, effective, and potent, our program included a community gathering in the Commons Room of the Cathedral of Learning, which not only is perhaps the most beautiful location on campus, but which also had been a very busy vaccination site 50 years earlier. It included a 2-day scientific symposium, which included some of our guests today, including Paul Offit and Peter Salk. It included the erection of an historic plaque outside of our own Salk Hall, and it included a dinner featuring remarks from historian David Oshinsky, who received the Pulitzer Prize for his book, Polio, An American Story. The cover of the contemporaneous Pitt magazine featured a photo of a baby being vaccinated. A few years later, the documentary, The Shot Heard Round the World, The Shot Felt Round the World, was released. And I do want to thank Carl Kurlander, the distinguished, hardworking, successful Hollywood producer and screenwriter who came home, joined the Pitt faculty, and played a big, big role in the creation of this documentary. I also want to thank our friends and neighbors at WQED who currently hold the rights to the documentary and have permitted us to use certain portions of it today. The report chronicling the development of the vaccine and our recognition of it was entitled Defeat of an Enemy. The title itself contains some sense of the feelings that drove what was a truly joyous celebration of a pioneering effort to overcome a deadly and disabling disease. That vaccine development effort was gratefully, and it seemed at the time, universally seen to be an extraordinary contribution to the collective well-being of the children of this country and of the world. In celebrating, we not only expressed pride in what had occurred 50 years earlier, but were buoyed by the medical advances that had been made in the intervening 5 decades, and were also captured by high hopes for the further advances that we were sure would lie ahead. A troubling question on the minds of many today is whether we have lost our ability to forge such victories or even to come together to celebrate them in the same way. One critical step may be doing a better job of developing common understandings about vaccines and what they can and cannot accomplish. With the guidance from an extraordinary group of speakers and panelists, we hope to advance that goal today. We begin with Peter Salk. It has been said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, the one picture you see up there then is going to be worth 2,000 words today because I know Peter's going to show it too. But I could not resist this photograph of Peter Salk as a student from the Falk Laboratory School here at the University of Pittsburgh, receiving the vaccine while his mother looked on. This was not the last time that a vaccine brought Peter and his father together. In fact, they partnered on research at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, research focused on the biology and immunotherapy of cancer and autoimmune disease, as well as strategies for vaccine production. Peter also later worked on strategies for developing an inactivated vaccine for HIV infection and helped introduce AIDS treatment programs in Africa and Asia. Before Peter takes his place at the podium, we are going to show the short trailer from the documentary, The Shot Felt Round the World. And again, I don't want to acknowledge Carl Kurlander and WQED. So we'll watch this trailer for about 3 minutes, and then Peter will come to the podium to share some of his thoughts with you.
we look back upon polio today, you look back upon what was really a summer plague. It came every year. It came like locusts. There was no prevention. There was no cure. There was no protection.
I grew up in a family where there was a sense, that my dad was a scientist. He actually would talk about how he used to, as a child, pray that he could do something good for humanity.
He was the miracle worker in the white coat on the one hand, but he was also an incredibly hard-working, devoted scientist for whom people were willing to sacrifice.
He was challenging medical orthodoxy.
All of the people who mattered in virology, John Enders, Albert Sabin, Tom Rivers, and others, basically believed in a live virus vaccine. And here is Jonas Salk, someone who was younger, going in exactly the opposite direction.
He was well aware of the early vaccine failures. The first attempt with an inactivated polio vaccine killed kids.
It's a testament to his courage and resolve that he could inoculate children with something that he knew started out as live, dangerous poliovirus.
The stakes couldn't be higher. Vaccines are always a matter of risk versus reward, and nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect.
We didn't have to really be stimulated very much because up on the third floor was the polio ward where they had all the iron lungs.
And I remember the faces on some of these kids, in agony. Just picture your own 2-year-old. It's just dreadful.
The vaccination was 80 to 90% effective against paralytic poliomyelitis.
The guy gets off the elevator. He never got into the room. It works, they were yelling.
There were newspaper reporters that ran to telephones to quickly get this as a front-page headline on probably every newspaper in this country.
Kids ran out into the street, factory whistles went off, church bells tolled. It was in a way as if a war had ended. Jonas Salk became a national hero. He was on the cover of Time. Newsweek called him one of the greatest Americans. President Eisenhower invited him to the White House and actually broke down. This is a sign of how great American medicine is at this time. It is an extraordinarily wonderful, optimistic moment, okay? And there is reason to be proud. Jonas Salk is the people's scientist. Whom do we remember? Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, Jonas Salk. It's perfect.
Mark, thank you for having put this forum together and for all those who've come to join us here today. It's really heart-lifting to be looking back on what happened now 70 years ago and the work that took place in the years before that, and to take a moment to reflect on how we need to move ourselves best into the future to preserve the kind of momentum that has been developed over all of these years for the sake of humanity. I want to show you a few slides today just to position that moment in terms of what has happened next, where we stand now with respect to polio, and have that as a basis for reflection about the future. So we've seen this image already, and we understand from the trailer that we've just seen how significant a problem polio was at that time. I want to show you a few things about the development of the vaccine that took place here at the University of Pittsburgh. My father was a bit of a pack rat, and when he ended up moving to California, took with him artifacts from the laboratory work that was done. What you see in this slide are 4 different bottles that were crucial in the development of a safe and effective vaccine, which had to do with understanding what needs to be done to make sure the virus is completely inactivated and that the vaccine would be safe. What you're seeing are samples of materials that had been the virus that was incubated with formaldehyde or formalin. And incubated for different periods of time. 14 hours, 25 and a half hours, 38 hours, 45 and a half hours. These materials have been donated by my brothers and me to the university, and when they're declared safe to transport here, in terms of what ever potential virus might be remaining, these will be part of the collection here at the University of Pittsburgh. And I want to show you how the results of an experiment just like this look when you graph them out. If you graph the inactivation in an ordinary sort of way, starting at 100% and going down 90, 80, 70, 50, this so-called arithmetic scale, you get an inactivation curve. Just shows you started at 100%, and within 2 days, you're down at a level that looks as if it's at 0, but you don't really know because you can't measure any further in the laboratory. So the trick that was done at that time was to take the same data points and graph them differently using a logarithmic scale, 100, 10, 1.1, etc. And when you do that, these same points turn into a straight line. And the trick here was then, because you can't measure below this line here, if you can project theoretically that this straight line will continue over the next period of time, you'll continue with this straight line inactivation. If you keep going to 9 days, you'll be down at a point when there may be 1 live virus particle left in 1 trillion doses of vaccine. So that was the basis for moving forward with this experimental program. The initial experiments had been done in the laboratory with mice, with monkeys, and then it became time in 1952 to move into children and see, do we really have something that's going to work in humans? The first tests were done in the brave children at the D.T. Watson Home for Crippled Children in Leedsdale, starting with kids who had had polio, and then extending the experiments out in that small number of children. The results looked good. Antibody responses developing that should be protective against the disease. Also at the Polk State School a bit further north. And then it became time to expand these studies further. It started in about 160 odd kids. That was so it started in the summer of 1952. By May of 1953, it was time to expand, moving to larger numbers. That was when the family were inoculated. You've seen this photo. Others in a smaller group, and then moving into the Pittsburgh school system. The public schools, the private schools, the parochial schools. There were however many number there were. Don Burke has been doing a lot of research on this with 7,500 or so kids and their families who were brave enough to step forward and continue and expand these early experiments. Don has referred to these as the pre-pioneers. This was a major next step in that program, which was then followed by this huge national field trial, 1.8 million children in the first, second, and third grades. These were the so-called polio pioneers, and all thanks to everyone, their families, those children who participated in that process, and you've already seen in the film the announcement of the results and the jubilation that occurred at that point. Kids began the vaccine was approved for use the same evening as the announcement of the results of the experiment were made after a year of analysis of data by Tommy Francis, who'd organized and evaluated that part of the program. Not everything went smoothly, and Paul Offit, who is here and will speak to us, wrote a book on the so-called Cutter incident, in which one of the manufacturers, the field trial vaccine, had been very securely analyzed and made sure that nothing would be a problem there. When it expanded out into some additional manufacturers and went into the hands of the government to supervise, some things did not go completely correctly in terms of how the program was handled with the inactivation and the supervision of the safety. There were 120,000 kids who ended up receiving a vaccine that still had live virus in it because the procedures had not been completely followed correctly to do this safely. Everything was tightened up, and that has never happened since, but it was a terrible experience for those who ended up being affected, developing polio, and for the fear that was induced by that experience. So things don't always go as you want. That was a very major blip in the road, but again, things were tightened up, and that didn't happen again. There was another approach to making polio vaccines, which was a live virus approach using attenuated virus that was weakened. My father was concerned about potential dangers with that, looking at the effect of what happened when starting in 1941 with increasing incidences of the incidence of paralytic polio, the inactivated vaccine developed here at the University of Pittsburgh, introduced. Within 7 years, the incidence of polio in this country fell by 97%. At that time, then, the oral vaccine that was on the sugar cube was introduced, and we'll do the same trick here and graph these data using a logarithmic scale. And what you see is that starting with the introduction of the injected vaccine, the incidence of this dotted line, the incidence of polio just went down year by year by year in a straight line until by the end of the 70s, it was gone in this country. The fears about the live vaccine were justified, and what turned out to take place was that the weakened viruses had the ability to revert back to a dangerous form when they were growing in the intestinal tract. And some children, somewhere between 8 and 12 children every single year, ended up developing polio as following their ingestion of the oral vaccine or their close contacts, like mothers changing diapers. And that persisted for some time until finally the decision was made to stop using the oral vaccine in this country and go back to the injected vaccine. Life doesn't always proceed smoothly, again, and we learn everything we can from the process to improve and perfect how things are handled. Just to say that in Sweden and Finland that only use the injected vaccine, once it was introduced, within 12 years, polio was gone in that country. You couldn't even detect virus in the sewage. Smallpox at the end of the 70s had been eradicated. This is the last naturally occurring case of smallpox. This was a model as to what could be done, and a global polio eradication initiative was undertaken to do the same thing with polio. Let's get this virus out of the world completely. It was based on using the oral vaccine, easy to administer, less expensive, but still there's the problems that were associated with that. The red countries on this map in 2012 were the only remaining countries that had naturally occurring polio still endemic within them. If you had looked at this map starting in 1955, every country would have been red. By 1988, when the Global Eradication Initiative was undertaken, we'd already gotten rid of polio in part of the Americas, Australia, Europe, and there were some countries that had gotten rid of it where there had been some recurrences. Just to give you an indication of what has taken place with that global effort. Another illustration of difficulties was that in the early part of the 2000s, it was noticed that The vaccine, the viruses from the vaccine that had reverted to virulence could circulate within the population and spread and cause outbreaks every bit as severe as the naturally occurring wild polioviruses. So here we are with a situation where the question was, how do we deal with this? The decision was made to take the type 2 virus out of the vaccine, make sure that people would be, the children would be injected with the initial vaccine as a safety measure. Things didn't always go perfectly there either, but here's the overall picture. 1955, 600,000 cases a year of polio. Start of the eradication effort, down to 125 countries with 350,000 cases of polio. Numbers from 2010 to last year, down as low as 6 cases in only 3 countries. Last year, there was more of a blip, 99 in Pakistan and Afghanistan, just those 2 countries. Polio caused by these circulating viruses. When the decision was made to change the vaccination regimen and drop the type 2 out of the oral vaccine, things didn't go perfectly there either, and there was a resurgence. And so last year, we're down to a more containable level. So here's where we stand now. This has been the trajectory since the introduction. We're really getting close to the end. What happened in this country was that the cases of paralytic polio were reduced down to the point where the line shows the naturally occurring virus, the bars are showing cases of polio caused by the oral vaccine. Finally, the decision was made to stop using the oral vaccine in this country, go back only to the injected vaccine, and since then, that problem has gone in this country. Almost at the end, just to point out the factors that stand in the way of completing the successful eradication effort: religious, cultural, political differences in countries that are on the receiving end of the vaccine and those that are wanting to get this process completed. There are problems with accessibility to vaccination programs and active resistance to vaccination efforts in parts of the world. There are other problems, health problems, more important to recipient populations than polio at this point. Problems with surveillance, missing cases when you're trying to understand where we are now. The inherent problems with existing vaccines, I've talked about some. So all of these things have to be balanced together and strengthen the question of the issue of needing to strengthen routine immunization programs. We're almost there. We're closing in on zero. We still have to deal with all of these efforts. So I wanted just to give a sense of connecting the past with the present, the trajectory, what the job that still needs to be done. We do the best we can, and we have to keep with it, both with polio and with all of the other illnesses that we need to turn attention on so that we can live in the healthiest world possible. So, thanks.
In deciding who would be the best possible keynote speaker for this event, I talked to 3 people: Don Burke, Peter Salk, and Art Levine, the former Senior Vice Chancellor for the Health Sciences here at Pitt. Each of the 3, without hesitation or qualification, quickly named Paul Offit and essentially refused to talk about any alternatives. I was very pleased then that Paul was not only able to work this program into his schedule, but actually seemed eager to do so. Dr. Offit is the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as the director of the Vaccine Education Center, professor of pediatrics in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And simply stated, it would be hard to find a person who is more highly respected in his field. I could take the rest of the afternoon simply reading the awards and honors that have been bestowed upon him. Not wanting to do that, let me instead give a small sampling. Among many other honors, he has received the President's Certificate for Outstanding Service from the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Humanitarian of the Year Award from the Biologics Industry Organization, the David Rogers Award from the American Association of Medical Colleges, the Odyssey Award from the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest, and the Sabin Vaccine Institute Gold Medal. He is the co-inventor of a rotavirus vaccine, which has been recommended by the CDC and the World Health Organization for universal use in combating diarrhea in children. Though far less common in this country, diarrhea is the third leading cause of death among children worldwide, claiming some 500,000 lives every year. Another leading vaccinologist has estimated that the vaccine developed by Dr. Offit and his colleagues saves hundreds of lives every day. For that work, he received the Luigi Mastroianni, sorry, Paul, and William Osler Awards from the Penn School of Medicine, the Charles Mérieux Award from the National Foundation for Infectious Diseases, and also was recognized by the Gates Foundation as it launched its Living Proof Project for global health. Dr. Offit has been a prolific writer, authoring more than 160 medical and scientific journal papers and 11 medical narratives. His writings clearly reflect the fact that he understands both the promise and the limitations of medicine. To pick up on that latter point, among his publications are Pandora's Lab, 7 Stories of Science Gone Wrong, Overkill, When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far, and You Bet Your Life, From Blood Transfusions to Mass Vaccinations, The Long and Risky History of Medical Breakthroughs. He also is a recipient of the Robert B. Ballas Prize in Critical Thinking, which was awarded by the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry for another publication, Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine. He was the only member of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices to vote against the preemptive use of the smallpox vaccine at a time of heightened concerns about bioterrorism, believing that the risks outweighed the potential benefits. At Pitt, we are proud to claim Dr. Offit as one of our own, since he did his residency at Children's Hospital here in Pittsburgh. In fact, it was the death of a patient in his care as a resident that fueled his efforts to develop the rotavirus vaccine. Dr. Offit has been awarded the Porter Prize by our School of Public Health, and he was a presenter at the 50th anniversary celebration of the Salk polio vaccine in 2005. Please, everybody, join with me in welcoming Paul Offit back to Pitt.
Thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. You know, I'm going to ask you to do my eulogy. Is that all right? I'll have RFK Jr. do the rebuttal. Sorry. So, my parents were children of the 1920s. Their parents, my grandparents, were worried about diphtheria, which would kill 15,000 people a year. They were worried about pertussis, or whooping cough, which would kill 8,000 to 9,000 people a year, mostly children. I was a child of the 1950s. My parents weren't worried about either of those diseases because we had vaccines. What my parents were worried about is they were worried about polio, which would kill, as you just learned, could kill as many as 1,500 people a year and could paralyze as many as 50,000. They were worried about measles, which would cause about 50,000 hospitalizations from pneumonia and dehydration, and occasionally encephalitis, which is infection of the brain or inflammation of the brain. About a quarter of those people, about 1,000 people every year, would be left blind or deaf. They were worried about mumps, which was the most common cause of acquired deafness. They were worried about rubella, or German measles, which was, when it infected pregnant women, would cause children to have a very high incidence of blindness or deafness or heart defects. Now, I did my residency here in the late 1970s at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. That's when the Pirates were good. So there was a time when the Pirates were good. And we had, Andy Urbach probably remembers this, but we had an emergency department shift when you would be like on 12 hours, off 12 hours. And during that time, I would do 1, 2, sometimes 3 spinal taps a night. Because what didn't exist yet was we didn't have a meningococcal vaccine, or we didn't have a Haemophilus influenza B vaccine, or we didn't have a pneumococcal vaccine. What's interesting is that today, residents at our hospital, at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, don't know how to do spinal taps. They don't do them enough. So when kids come in and have a question of meningitis, it's the interventional radiologist that does the spinal tap. Now, my children were born in the 1990s. And my wife and I weren't worried about any of these diseases, which is part of the problem. I think not only have we eliminated diseases like measles, which we really eliminated by the year 2000, it's come back in large part because a critical percentage of parents are choosing not to vaccinate their children. And that's because we've eliminated the memory of measles. People don't remember how sick or how dead that virus can make you. So now we focus on vaccine safety issues, real or imagined. But one safety issue was real, as Dr. Salk alluded to, which brings us back to the polio vaccine. So, to repeat, on April 12, 1955, when Dr. Salk, Jonas Salk's vaccine was claimed to be, noted to be safe, effective, and potent, it was a dramatic moment. I mean, that was a 1.8 million child study. That was probably the largest single study of a medical product ever. And when it was found to be safe and effective, church bells rang out, synagogues held special prayer meetings, the Voice of America carried that story over for the world, department stores stopped and made that announcement over the loudspeakers. And my mother cried. I mean, I remember this, in part because I was in a polio ward for about 6 weeks. I didn't have polio. I had a failed operation on my right foot, but that left me in this polio ward for about 6 weeks. It was called Cernan's Hospital for Crippled Children, because that was back in the days when you could use words like crippled and feeble-minded in the names of children's hospitals. But that was a scarring experience. I mean, I remember our lungs. I remember children getting the so-called Sister Kenny hot pack treatments, where they would take these scalding hot packs and put it on withered arms and legs in the hopes that that could help to restore function. I saw those children as vulnerable and helpless and alone, and it was really a Dickens-like experience. My mother was ill with a complication with a pregnancy with my brother. My father was a traveling salesman, so actually never came to visit me. And there was sort of one visiting hour a week. I remember Sundays from 2 to 3. That was the one visiting hour. But I think that that experience really is why I chose pediatrics. I think it's why I chose pediatric infectious diseases. I think it's why I chose to write a book about polio, because I think the scars of our childhood invariably become the passions of our adulthood. So Jonas Salk's vaccine was used, as Dr. Salk, Peter Salk said, into the early 1960s when it was replaced by Albert Sabin's vaccine. And the reason it was replaced by this now, you had a killed virus vaccine that was replaced by live weakened viral vaccine. There were advantages to that Albert Sabin's vaccine. It was cheaper. It could be given by mouth, so just as back then, a little red dot on a sugar cube, which was delicious, by the way. And it also evoked something called contact immunity, which is not herd immunity. Contact immunity is when you immunize someone in the home, about 25% of people in that home who were susceptible to this virus could also essentially be immunized because that vaccine virus was shed in the feces. The one reason that was given at the time that was wrong was that the thinking was that the only way you could get long-term immunity was by having either a natural infection or being inoculated with a live weakened virus. And Jonas Salk showed that that wasn't true. He really had done studies showing that you could get a memory response or an anamnestic response by giving another dose of polio vaccine or another dose of polio vaccine, that you would get a memory response. So he predicted correctly that you would probably have long-term memory with just giving an inactivated virus. I mean, now we know that that's also true with just a purified protein vaccine, like the hepatitis B vaccine, the human papillomavirus vaccine. Those are just one protein vaccines, single protein vaccines, yet induce long-lived memory. And so we eliminated polio from the United States by 1979. But we didn't eliminate polio caused by the polio vaccine, the oral polio vaccine. And so every year you would, roughly the incidence of polio from the oral polio vaccine was about 1 per 2.4 million doses. It was a rare consequence, but it was real. That was the price we paid for going to the oral polio vaccine. That's the price we paid for something that was cheaper, for something that induced contact immunity, that's something that was easily given, and something that certainly worked better in the developing world where ease of administration and expense mattered. So why did that happen? I mean, why could the oral polio vaccine cause polio? And the reason is it's, although this virus, the oral polio vaccine virus strains were unable to reproduce, those viruses were unable to reproduce in the nervous system, in the brain or spinal cord. That virus reproduced perfectly well in the intestine and could be shed for weeks and sometimes months in the intestine. So it's replicating and replicating and replicating in the intestine. It's a single-stranded RNA virus, so its replication is not highly faithful, and those strains that were developed by Albert Sabin weren't highly mutated for attenuation for neurovirulence, meaning for being able to cause polio. So it could be where the virus could essentially revert back to paralytic type, and that happened in 8 to 10, sometimes 12 children a year. So when I was asked to be on the advisory committee for immunization practices in 1998, it was my mission to get us away from the oral polio vaccine. It was unconscionable to me that you had a safer vaccine that was available, the inactivated vaccine. An inactivated vaccine, as Peter said, that could basically has been used in Scandinavian countries to eliminate polio, and that we were still using an oral polio vaccine. And what surprised me is there was enormous pushback from other members of the committee to move away from the oral polio vaccine to the inactivated vaccine. So they would argue, and these were, major players. I was younger then, and these people were all more senior than I was. People like D.A. Henderson, who was involved with basically eliminating smallpox from this world, or Sam Katz, who was critical to the development of the measles vaccine. Or John Abramson, who was head of the American Academy of Pediatrics. They felt that we would be spending essentially $4.2 million per case of vaccine-associated paralytic polio to prevent, and that was too much. So what I did was I brought a guy named John Salamone onto the working group. So I was fortunate enough to be head of that polio working group, and I asked this basically a citizen to be part of that working group. He was a man whose son had been paralyzed by the oral polio vaccine, and he thought this isn't right. This vaccine should have a black box warning on it. I didn't know that. I, John Salamone, didn't know that. I didn't know that you could get polio from the polio vaccine, but it was my right to know that. He was savvy, he was persistent. He was the head of the Italian American Association, so he was used to dealing with people in Congress, and I don't know how one can ever get used to that, but nonetheless, he was used to that, and he really had everything to do with why we went back to the inactivated vaccine, because he wasn't treated particularly well, because he would show up, for example, at these American Academy of Pediatrics national meetings, and he had a group called Informed Parents Against Vaccine-Associated Paralytic Polio. So it was kind of a tortured acronym, but it was IPAV, and he was kind of put in the corner, you know, like, and kind of ignored. He would bring other children who were paralyzed by that vaccine. It was sort of like a scene out of Kafka's The Hunger Artist. I mean, he was kind of like a cage in the corner. He was put in that position because they saw him as an anti-vaccine activist, and he wasn't. He really was a vaccine safety activist. He had a vaccine safety issue, which is not true with many vaccine safety activists today, where, for example, autism is constantly brought up as a vaccine issue when it's not. But in anything, he was a brave man who stood tall in that and really had everything to do with why we moved back to the inactivated vaccine. The question is now, where are we? We have we basically let the dragon out of the cave with the oral polio vaccine. I mean, as Peter showed, you have far more cases of polio caused by the strains that were derived from that oral polio vaccine than from wild-type virus. I mean, there was the outbreak in Gaza was caused by those strains, those revertant strains. There was a man in Rockland County, a 27-year-old man who never left this country, who was in a area code that had a very low immunization rate, about 30%. And he got polio from one of these revertant strains. And when they looked at the wastewater samples in his county, Rockland County, the virus was there. Because when you get polio and you get paralyzed by it, that's the tip of a much bigger iceberg. Only about 1 of 200 people who are infected with poliovirus are paralyzed by it. So when you saw a case of paralysis, you knew there were at least a couple hundred other cases around him that were infected with that virus, but that didn't become paralyzed. So when they looked in Rockland County, they found that virus in the wastewater samples. When they looked in surrounding counties, they found it. And what I think the CDC should have done then is look everywhere. Look in Philadelphia, look in Chicago, look in Los Angeles, because I would argue, given that international travel is common, given that the oral polio vaccine is given in many other countries, given that that virus is hardy. I mean, any virus that lives in the intestine can live in sewage. So it's a hardy virus and it lasts. And I think we are never going to get rid of polio in this world until we get rid of the oral polio vaccine. And I think that's going to take a long time. But it makes you wonder, and I'll just conclude here, is did we pay too high of a price when we moved from the inactivated polio vaccine to the oral vaccine? But Jonas Salk got it right, and certainly in this country he has the last best vaccine, and hopefully that will also be true in the world. But thank you for your attention.
In the summer of 2006, I was visiting a medical school that had been created by one of our graduates in India. And my hosts were gracious enough to have a research presentation that focused principally on a CDC grant that was designed to promote research partnerships between Johns Hopkins and the researchers at this school. Though I realized that this reflects a kind of petty, non-productive form of competitiveness, at that point in my life, the question that would immediately come to my mind is, well, why aren't we partners on that grant? Fortunately, I kept that question in my mind, and I comforted myself by thinking, again in a very juvenile way, that Johns Hopkins might have that grant, but they were in the process of losing a very good faculty member, and we were in the process of gaining a very good dean, because at that moment, Don Burke was traveling from Baltimore to Pittsburgh to become the dean of our School of Public Health. He became the longest-serving dean in the history of that school, and he led with distinction. He also served as the inaugural holder of the Jonas Salk Chair in Global Health, as director of our Center for Vaccine Research, and as Associate Vice Chancellor for Global Health. While dean, he also led an NIH infectious disease modeling center of excellence. At Johns Hopkins, Don had been a professor of international health and served as director of its Center for Immunization Research. And before joining Johns Hopkins, he had served on active duty for 23 years at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, where he directed medical research on virus diseases of importance to the military. Don has authored more than 300 articles, has served in key advisory roles to the World Health Organization, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the NIH, the FDA, and the CDC. He is past president of the American Society of Tropical Medicine, was the recipient of the John Snow Award for Epidemiology from the American Public Health Association, and the Langmuir Lectureship of the American Epidemiological Society. He also is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. Even more important than that, he and I are basketball buddies, and he has played a key role in shaping this event, and he is in charge of the panel discussion, which is about to begin. So let me invite Dean Emeritus Don Burke to the front of the room.
So you've already met Paul and Peter. Let me introduce the two other panelists that we have. The first is Dr. Julia Van. Dr. Van became the Allegheny County Health Department Director in June of 2024. She obtained her doctorate in medicine from Carol Davila University of Medicine and Pharmacy in Bucharest, Romania, and her master's in public health analysis and management from the East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. In 2014, she began her public health career in government roles across North Carolina. In 2020, she rose to the top job of the health department in Guilford County, the home of Greensboro, where she successfully led the COVID pandemic response. In 2024, she was selected from among dozens of candidates to be the new Allegheny County Health Director. I was on the search committee, and I was happy to. Thank you. As Director of the Health Department, Dr. Van is responsible for clean air, food safety, healthy housing, curbing violence and overdoses, emergency preparedness, and vaccines, to name a few. By all accounts, she's off to a terrific start in leading the public health in our county. Thanks for being with us today, Julia.
Thank you.
Our other panelist is Terrence Dermody. He is the Vera Hines Distinguished Professor and Chair of Pediatrics at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine and Physician-in-Chief and Scientific Director at UPMC Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, where he leads a team of over 350 faculty members. He's also Professor of Microbiology and Molecular Genetics at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. Terry received his BS degree from Cornell University and his MD degree from Columbia University. With over 36 years of experience in basic virology and viral pathogenesis research, at his core, Dr. Dermody is a virologist. Most of his research has focused on reovirus, an important experimental model for studies of viral encephalitis in the young. His research contributions have enhanced an understanding of how these viruses enter into host cells and cause organ-specific disease. He also has a long list of recognition. I'll just tell you that he's the past president of the American Society of Virology. Terry, we're grateful to have your expertise as a physician scientist on the panel with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
The format here is that I'm the moderator, and so what I'll do is I'll pose questions to the panelists and have them answer that. For the most part, I'll direct it to an individual, but it's open and anybody can answer on any of these questions. They have seen the questions before, so that's so let me start one with just sort of a general interest question. Do most pediatricians vaccinate their kids?
Yes.
I'd say yes, too.
Okay. Do they have any hesitation? So when we hear about the vaccine skeptics, I think an important thing to say is pediatricians vaccinate their own kids. And that means they deeply and profoundly believe that these are the right things to do. Okay, it's not always an easy choice, and Paul has told us that vaccines aren't perfect. But I do think it's important to start off with this, establishing the fact that this is something that is a core belief in pediatricians and doctors generally.
You know, just add this. I think when you're injecting someone with a biological agent, there's always a little bit of hesitation. I think that's true. You know, I watched my son, when he was born, get his hepatitis B vaccine in the first 24 hours. I would argue I was an informed consumer about that vaccine. But still, there's a little hesitation. And I'll give you one other example. So I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, and in December of 2020, we considered both Pfizer and Moderna's vaccine. So you're given roughly before each of those meetings where you're going to either authorize or vote to authorize or not authorize that vaccine, you read about 400 pages, 200 from the company, 200 from the FDA, and so it's 800 pages that you read basically. But you're still a little worried. You are. It's always, you're a little worried because you know that this vaccine now is going to be given to hundreds of millions of people, whereas you know, you're only looking at tens of thousands of people. But if you look at, for example, like the measles vaccine, which seems to be something people that are hesitant about now, I mean, that vaccine's been out there for 60 years. I think everything you need to know about that vaccine, for the most part, you know. So I would just make that distinction.
Okay. Good, Terry.
And I would just follow up by saying I have two sons. They're grown now, and I do remember those days, Paul. Whether it was hepatitis B or the first DPTs or their MMR, and I don't know whether it was Margot or I were more concerned just about needle into the thigh of our beautiful infant boys and what that was going to be like. The other point I wanted to make, a question you could have asked, do pediatricians volunteer for vaccine trials? And with COVID, we've been doing vaccine research in Pittsburgh for a very long time, I've heard. And I've been here just for 9 years, but I read a bit about that. And of course, with the COVID pandemic, we stood up a new entity, the Pittsburgh Vaccine Trials Unit, and did phase 3 trials for Moderna and for the J&J vaccine. And many of my colleagues volunteered to be in that phase 3 Moderna trial. I volunteered to be in that phase 3 Moderna trial, and Margaret wanted to see if I survived it. And since I did, she volunteered for the J&J trial.
I just wanted to add that I do have 2 children, so not just pediatricians, but family medicine. We vaccinate our kids too. I have a 10-year-old and I have a 7-year-old, so definitely making the decision to vaccinate our children was something that we talked about as parents and as partners in our marriage. And it's not easy as a mother to sit there and know that you are going to make your child cry. They're going to cry when they're going to get that vaccine, but knowing that the risk that we would put them at if they're not getting the vaccine is 1,000 times higher than just that one small discomfort, definitely made us move forward with that. But it's a real thing, as parents, we don't want to see our kids, upset and crying, but we knew that it's going to be way better for them moving forward. So,
just one thing. Walt Ornstein, who was the head of the National Immunization Program, his mother, you may know this story, but his mother was driving him to get his vaccine, which was going to be the polio vaccine then, it's the mid-1950s. And he said to his mother, I don't want to go. I mean, I'm going to cry. And his mother looked at him and said, better you should cry than I should cry.
I do have Paul brought up the history of the measles vaccine. I had a couple slides here. Is it possible to put that up? Yeah, so a few years ago, the team at the School of Public Health had a study on vaccines prevented by diseases prevented by vaccines, and we put that into some graphics. And so the next slide here. So here's a graphic of measles in the United States. Along the bottom is the year, and on each line is a state in the United States. And the color intensity is how many measles cases there were. So back in 1928, 35, 43, you go up that every state had an annual epidemic. Every state had a streak, which was yellow or red. And then you came across to 1963 when the vaccine was introduced. That's the vertical red line. And within 2 years, the disease had essentially disappeared from the United States. So is that all clear to you now? Well, what that does is that explains this hideous tie that I've been wearing, in case you've been wondering. So this is the same here. Each state is like this, and this is the red line that goes across, and it shows that. And so after we published this article, I got an email from somebody who just read it that said, figure 2C really is beautiful. You ought to make neckties and scarves out of that. So we took them up on it. We had it, and so each of the panelists got as one of their rewards one of these hideous neckties and scarves.
Yes, but we were told not to wear them because only one person was able to wear a tie.
All right. Well, let me, again, keeping it sort of on a personal level before I know you've had experience in developing vaccines. Other people I have had experience in developing. Others had personal experience in developing vaccines?
No, I have not.
Yeah, Peter?
Well, I worked with my father when he was working on an inactivated vaccine for HIV/AIDS, which was to be initially used in individuals who had been infected with the virus in order to try and prevent the syndrome from developing. It was interesting working on that. My father was, again, using an inactivated vaccine principle. The initial results looked promising. It never did move to fruition, but it was an adventure, certainly, to be a part of that process.
Yeah, I should say that when I was at Walter Reed, the Army was working with Dr. Salk for a while on inactivated HIV vaccines, and that's where I first got to meet him myself, and so that was a real memorable time of my life. So, Terry, any experiences you want to?
Sure, I'll relate an experience. Not all vaccines you develop work. I just have to say that. Our team is very interested in how viruses move throughout the body and infect specific sites within us. And we're particularly interested in brain infections. That's what we study. And most of the work we do, we think of as journey-based science. Science where the questions intrigue us and the answers to those questions are actually more interesting than how we started and give rise to new questions, like a tree develops branches and arborizes and just goes forever. That's what we do. But every once in a while, we think that a finding we've made might actually make a contribution to improving human health. So we developed a strategy to engineer the virus that we study to display little bits of other viruses, like little bits of HIV. And we engineered reoviruses that express little bits of HIV. And don't you know that antibodies from human beings infected with HIV recognized the viruses that we made? And we thought this might be a good vaccine candidate. But it turns out when we gave it to mice, they didn't develop antibodies against that bit, nor did rabbits. And so we thought, well, we gave it a good, honest try. And by that time, Paul has developed a vaccine that saves the lives of millions of people. So he should probably talk about it.
So Paul had said that I worked when I was at Walter Reed. We had a vaccine development program for the military for diseases of military importance. And we developed the first hepatitis A vaccine anywhere in the world. And I was the department chief at the time, and so we gave it to each other. I was the 6th person in the world to get the hepatitis A vaccine because that's the way you did it in those times. And so the reason for asking the question is, why did you do it? Why were you interested in developing a vaccine? What motivated you? Just tell me about what's your motivation.
Okay, so the certainly, I mean, I saw a child die of rotavirus when I was at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, and it was jarring. It was a mother who was very attentive to her baby. It was a 9-month-old little girl, and the problem with rotavirus is it causes fever, vomiting, diarrhea. In this country, it would cause 70,000 hospitalizations and about 20 to 60 deaths a year, but in the world, it would kill 500,000 people a year because of issues of medical access, et cetera. So what struck me about this was that she tried. I mean, she called her doctor. The child has fever, vomiting, diarrhea. He's saying give sips of, sort of fluids that contain, sugar and electrolytes. But, when you're vomiting, it's hard to do that. That's why the oral rehydration effort by the World Health Organization to try and curtail those 500,000 deaths really never worked. And so she came in and was severely dehydrated. When we brought her back to the treatment room, and we couldn't get an intravenous line into her because she was so dehydrated. She was just completely clamped down. So we called the surgeon to come down and try and put a line into her neck, which we weren't comfortable doing. And in the meantime, and it was Nancy Caesar, was the senior resident at the time. But I saw something I'd never seen before, was something called clysis, where basically what she did was she took a bone marrow needle and drilled it into the sort of upper part of her tibia to try and just get fluids into her bone marrow, which then hopefully would be absorbed into the circulation. But it didn't work. And by the time that the surgeon came down, we were trying to resuscitate this child and couldn't. And then the worst thing in the world when you're a pediatric resident was the next moment, which is you have to go out to a waiting room and tell a mother whose child was perfectly healthy 2 days ago that she's died. And that always stuck with me. But when my work was done with Stan Plotkin and Fred Clark at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, just to be perfectly honest about this, you never think you're making a vaccine. I mean, it's always the first paragraph of your grant. I mean, it's this terrible disease. There needs to be a vaccine. We need to understand this virus. But I think if you go in thinking you're going to make a vaccine, you'll be fairly disappointed. So you're trying to understand the virus. What parts of the virus make you sick, what parts of the virus induce an immune response that's protective. You're trying to make strains that could be a vaccine, but just to be honest, you never really think you're making one because that would drive you crazy, I think. There's not a lot of people that, able to be co-inventors of a medical product, but I mean, I was lucky to be with Stan Plotkin, who was the developer was the inventor of the rubella vaccine. Fred Clark was just a brilliant DVM PhD who understood animal rotaviruses. So I was just a lucky guy to be in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
So you mean you didn't do it for the money?
Yeah, I'll tell you, who goes into science for money?
Well, the reason I ask that is, that is now what is often said about people who are promoting vaccines, is that you're in it for the money.
Yeah, it's one story about this. So again, nobody goes into science. If I could just invent it, right? It's the long game, right? If I could just invent this vaccine 26 years later. But I was on Stephen Colbert's show, and it was still the Colbert Report. Do you remember the Colbert Report? All right, so it was the second time I was on a show, but it's like you sit around the big C. So I'm as close to him as I am to Don. And he says, one of the questions he asks, he says, so it's out there, you're in the pocket of industry, how do you respond to that? So I said, well, at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, we're not in the pocket of industry. If anything, we're in the pocket of children because of this, this, and this. So the studio audience, which is about 300 people, booed loudly. And I'll tell you why in a second. So then he gave me it's sort of live to tape. So it's not, although it's a live studio audience, it's taped, thank God. So he was Colbert's father was an immunology infectious disease person in South Carolina. So he died when Stephen Colbert was young in a plane crash. But so he's very sympathetic to science. And he said to me, okay, I'm going to give you another chance to answer this. Try again. So the second time I said something like, you can't on the one hand praise science, praise vaccines for being safe and effective without at some level praising those that make them safe and effective, meaning the companies. And then I looked at the studio audience, which you're specifically told not to do. And I said, was that any better? And they cheered. So then when he edited it, I'm saying like something nice about pharmaceutical companies, and then people are cheering for the first time ever on American television. But when I was walking out, I asked the associate producer, why did people boo? And she said, well, when you said you were in the pocket of children, it made you sound like a pedophile. So now I get in the car with my daughter and wife. My daughter was 17 at the time. We're taking the car to the train station so I can go from New York back to Philly. And I said to my wife and daughter, I said, would you ever have thought of that? And my daughter says, yeah, that's why I booed.
All right, that's good. All right. So, anybody else was your father motivated by the money, Peter?
Oh my gosh, no. He was just interested in there was a problem that needed to be a problem that needed to be solved. That's the major thing. There was a scientific principle that was at issue, which is, can you use an inactivated vaccine against viral infections? He had been taught in medical school that you couldn't, and so that's what motivated him. And you know, there's stuff you see on the internet all the time about how he refused to patent the vaccine and how he forewent, whatever the right expression is, $7 billion or whatever it was. That's slightly magnified. The fact of the matter is, all he was interested in was this work. And there was an effort to try and put together a patent. The patent attorney that had been retained by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, well, I'm not sure what the reasons were for that. It may have been just to make sure that the vaccine was produced successfully. The patent attorney could never get my father's attention because he was working. So this was just, this wasn't a noble sacrifice, and I refused to do it. He says, please don't bother me.
So you might say, for those of you who don't know, his famous quote about patenting.
Well, oh yeah, and the day of the vaccine announcement, he was interviewed by Edward R. Murrow, who said, who asked him, Dr. Salk, who owns the patent to this vaccine? And it's interesting, you can see the videotape of this, and it was like this light went on inside my father, and he said, no, there is no patent. Could you patent the sun?
Right. So all right, well, thank you. We could go into motivations a little bit more. But having said that, of course, somebody's out to make money on the vaccines. And so the pharmaceutical companies do make money, and the execs do make money. But, so how do you feel about that? Do you think that, do you boo them? You do boo people who are the people making money on vaccines?
Well, first of all, the only companies have the resources and expertise to make vaccines. The rotavirus vaccine was probably a $1.5 billion effort. And so they wouldn't do it unless there was a value to their shareholders. That's just true. It's not a big industry. I mean, it's a pretty fragile industry. There were 27 companies that made vaccines in 1955. By 1980, there were 18 companies that made vaccines. By the end of the decade, there were 4 companies that made vaccines for America's children. Any company that makes it was also making other products. Vaccines were less than 10% of what they do. Because the vaccines are something you give once or a few times in a lifetime. It's never going to compete with things like lipid-lowering agents or psychiatric drugs and neurological drugs, which are taken every day. So you can't compete with that. And so it's a fragile market. And make no mistake, you can lose this. I mean, companies would be perfectly willing to abandon it if you make it difficult enough. And this is, well, I'm not supposed to say anything about the politics, and I won't say anything, but I worry for the future of the industry.
Yeah. All right. Anybody else want to comment on I will say, I taught a course on vaccine policy issues, and I always had students, and it was about this question about, we would have the students, they take role playing about being the patient or the advocate or the vaccine producer. And the question was always, who gets to be the bad guy in here? And the bad guy was the person who was making money out of the vaccines off the backs of illness. And the fact is, in our society, somebody has to make some money, otherwise it's not going to happen. And so, that was an important teaching point for the students. Okay. Here's another one. Do you have any friends or relatives who are anti-vaccine? And so, how do you deal with them? people that are your friends or relatives?
I mean, I can jump in, and as a public health professional and being in a lot of different situations and having a lot of family members and friends, it is almost impossible not to encounter somebody that is experiencing some type of vaccine hesitancy or be on that spectrum of vaccine hesitancy, because I think it is a spectrum depending on where everybody is. So sometimes it is, from my perspective, disheartening to see that, but I think that it's really important in the way that we're actually addressing it, and the way that we're discussing it, and the way that we're putting it in perspective. So my approach, even if it's really hard, because I get really excited about it and just very, I feel very strongly about it. It's about being able to listen, being able to understand exactly where the concerns are coming from. There are many reasons why somebody can be concerned about the vaccine and choose to go into that vaccine hesitancy space, but having the ability to allow them to ask questions, or for you to ask questions of them, and really not preach to them. I think that that's something that doesn't really go well a lot of times. Sometimes we feel as, especially me as a public health professional, I feel like I can bring science and data and studies and research into that conversation, but a lot of time that doesn't necessarily go, as long as just tell me a little bit about your personal experience, and then I'll tell you about mine. Why did I choose to get vaccinated, or why do I choose to vaccinate my kids? And this is my perspective, and I completely understand that we may be on different, approaches to this, but just making it more human, just more level field, and just not sit on a ivory tower, like looking down. I don't see that as a good approach. And sometimes, bringing all of these ways of addressing it leaves the door open for that conversation to continue. Depending on where somebody is on that spectrum, you're not going to have one conversation with them and then they're going to decide that now they're going to get a vaccine, or they're going to get their kids vaccinated. But if you are handling that conversation with empathy, I think that it really keeps that door open for it to continue at another time, and maybe you will be able to have a different outcome at some point in time, but you're still remaining respectful. And we're talking about friends and family, so it can be challenging sometimes. Yeah. So
we've established that that the vaccine companies are not all necessarily evil. But what about the anti-vaxxers? Are there good anti-vaxxers? Are there people that that you think have a reasonable position?
Here's what I would say. I think it's perfectly reasonable to be skeptical of vaccines. It is. I mean, what you're asking is, you ask a lot of parents. You're asking them to give vaccines that prevent 14 different diseases in the first few years of life, which can mean as many as 25 inoculations during that time. It can mean as many as 5 shots at one time to prevent diseases most people don't see, using biological fluids most people don't understand. I think it would be surprising if there wasn't hesitancy about vaccines. Right. And so it's okay to ask the questions. It's important to ask the questions. And I think you have to be really sympathetic to that. I don't call those people anti-vax. I think they're just concerned about whether or not this is something they should be giving to their children, especially in a world where you don't see these diseases. I mean, on the other hand, I consider the anti-vaccine people the people who are paid to do it. I mean, people like Del Bigtree, Barbara Fisher, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., when he was head of Children's Health Defense. I mean, they're the professional anti-vaxxers, and they bother me because they're just consistently science denialists and often conspiracy theorists, and there's just no getting past that. There's no convincing them that it's reasonable to ask the question. Those are answerable questions. Does the MMR vaccine cause autism? You can answer that question. It's been answered in 24 separate studies. In 7 countries on 3 continents involving tens of thousands of people, it doesn't cause autism. Sorry. And so and when you can't convince people that because they just think there's a big conspiracy to hide the truth that's run by the pharmaceutical industry, that's really frustrating for me because it does a lot of harm.
Concur.
Let me push back a little bit on. I know Barbara Lowe Fisher. I even invited her to come to my vaccine policy class, and none of my fellow faculty at Hopkins liked it when I did that, because you don't give a forum to somebody who is is seen as unreliable as that. But I wanted her to come and talk to the class so that they understood and saw a person in person who she was.
You're a saint.
But I tell you, and what happened, of course, was that, and I did this, I had John Salmon come too, by the way.
Didn't he? He's great.
Yeah, he was terrific. And what would happen invariably is the students would hear them out, and I would say to them, you got them for the next 45 minutes, and if you can convince them, so much the better, and then after you're gone, I'm going to talk to them again. And we did that. Of course, the students were smart. Of course, they knew what was going on, and it worked. It worked to have them be personally. But the reason I tell you Barbara Lowe Fisher, she did have a child who was damaged by the original pertussis vaccine, right?
Wrong.
Okay.
I don't buy that. I mean, I think certainly the whole cell pertussis vaccine had a difficult safety profile, but there remains study after study showing it never caused permanent harm. I don't buy the fact that it caused either attention deficit disorder or seizure disorder or autism, whatever. There were certainly study after study, people like Marie Griffin and others have published study after study showing that. So I don't buy that. I know she believes that, and she holds that belief at the strength of a religious conviction,
Exactly.
but I just don't think that's right.
Okay.
No.
But I think that is the point, is that this is a person you will never convince her that no matter what you say, that that it is such, whether it's right or wrong, she believes it to be true because it was her kid. And so having that, and that was what I wanted the students to see, was that you're not going to be able to talk this person down.
Yeah, let me, I'm sorry, you want to talk? Let me just say
sorry, we're just going to have an argument here. This is going to be okay.
So you're always fighting the notion of what's the difference between coincidence and causality, because coincidence is a powerful thing. I think my wife is a private practicing pediatrician. She came into the office one day, it was a weekend. She was helping the nurse give vaccines. There was a 4-month-old sitting on her mother's lap. While my wife was drawing the vaccine up into the syringe, the 4-month-old had a seizure, went on to have a permanent seizure disorder, epilepsy, and was dead at age 5 of a chronic neurological condition. If she had given that vaccine 5 minutes earlier, there are no amount of statistical data in the world that would have convinced that mother anything other than the vaccine did this. We think I'm stupid. I mean, my child gets a vaccine, has a seizure, now is dead at age 5. I'm the mother of a vaccine-damaged child. And that's what you're up against. And it's really, really hard to fight emotion with statistics.
Yep.
And the point I was going to make, perhaps a more philosophical one, which is how we come to know things. And essentially there are two ways that we come to know things. We come to know things by our observations and evidence, and we can share what we know in the basis of what we know with others, and they will know that too. The other way we come to know things is what we believe. And by definition, a belief is not contestable. If you share a belief, some other person might also share that belief, or they may not. But there's no amount of evidence that you can present to someone to back your belief up that will encourage them to hold that belief, unless they will embrace that belief too. And to Paul's point, if there is a belief that there is an association of some untoward effect with the vaccine, it's not contestable. It's a belief. No amount of evidence in the world is going to change that belief. And if you're paid to have that view, it's even a firmer held belief. And so I really, this point that Ilya made just a moment ago about what we need, and we're struggling as a society, and we're struggling because we're having a very hard time connecting with others. And of course, this was a problem before COVID, and COVID made it a lot worse. And it's a struggle sometimes for us to have meetings where we don't offer a virtual option, so people don't have to come to the physical place to have the meeting, to actually see each other and maybe trade a story before the meeting starts. And then with the polarization in every segment of our society in almost every country in the world, it is really easy to isolate in groups that share your, in some cases, beliefs about things that could be contested with evidence, but you hold them as beliefs. And at this point, I think what we need more than anything else is, and I struggle with this, those who know me, to listen more and talk less.
I do too.
And I say that because you know, I'm a virologist. As I say, Don, I'm a simple country virologist from Nashville, Tennessee, because I spent 26 years there. I'm not a student of human evolution, but it fascinates me. And you know, our species of hominids, the Homo sapiens, well, we're not as big and strong as the Homo neanderthalis. Our brains aren't even as big as the Homo neanderthalis, but we outcompeted them. And they disappeared from the face of the earth about 50,000 years ago. And so why did that happen? And I don't know that anybody knows the answer, but what I read is that the Homo sapiens enjoyed working together. Helped them raise their children, helped them gather food, helped them fight off predators, and probably helped them eradicate Homo neanderthalis. So hardwired in our genes is the need to be together. And in a very short period of time, we're separated. And when you told the story of what happened on April 12, 1954, and our country celebrated that amazing accomplishment, the entire country, I was trying to think, could we do that again? Could something bring us together like that? You know, maybe Women's World Cup soccer, but could something do that? That was a science accomplishment? And I think the only way we're going to get there is if we listen more and talk less.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, Peter.
Yeah, I just wanted to add another angle to this, which is it's natural to learn from negative experiences. This is part of the way we, as a species and throughout evolution, learn what is safe and what's not safe in the environment. Our cat, several days ago, ate a meal of cat food and ended up throwing up. The cat has not gone back and been willing to eat that same food again, and that's natural. It's a protective response. I just did something and something bad happened. It's going to take a long time for us to get the cat back on food. It was a hairball that was the problem. And so we were attuned as a species to see things that happen in conjunction with each other and to learn from that. Paul, I'm going to morph a story that you told in one of your books, which had to do with a friend of yours or someone that you knew who took their child to a vaccine clinic to get vaccinated. I'm morphing your story. Came home, put the child in its crib, and a couple of hours later, the child was dead. What was this man to think other than this association? The problem with that, what I've left out of the story, is that the father took the child to the clinic. It was very busy. They waited and waited and ended up taking him home without the vaccine. So obviously it was not the vaccine that did this. This was something that was going to happen for other reasons, but we have experiences and we learn from them. So as part of this whole vaccine hesitancy business, we have to be really careful, because if we see something that's associated with vaccines, we say the natural result is, oh, it must have been the vaccine, as we've already talked about. So how do we deal with being able to discriminate and discover and be using our rational minds, our scientific skills to make the distinction between things that are just accidental. It's not cause and effect. How do I teach our cat it was not cause and effect? I'll never do that. But we have, as humans, the ability to discriminate between what is real and what's not. So here's where we need all of us to listen to each other. And for those people who are making careers out of developing the idea that vaccines are the cause of this, that, and another thing, autism, et cetera, we have to be able to engage in conversations which are two ways. We have to be willing to understand the hesitancy on the part of parents, but those that are promoting ideas that vaccines cause all this, that, and another thing, on their side too, they have to be able to be open to the evidence. Is this a cause and effect, or is it not? So I'll leave it at that.
I just want to add one more thing. I know that you're ready for the next question probably, and I'm not talking about like the people that are just professional mistrusters. I'm talking about just general people that mistrust is not necessarily irrational, that sometimes it can be earned. And I think that, it's critical to understand the fact that historically science, medicine, and the public health community has not always been incredibly ethical in the way that we have conducted different studies or the way that we have treated Black people, Indigenous people, people of color. So that is still incredibly valid, and that is still something that it's in the collective consciousness of people. So when we're telling, vulnerable communities to come and get the vaccine, trust us. We need to be mindful that sometimes we have not done the best of jobs to really protect these communities. So I think that we still need to keep that in mind when we're, putting the message out. Also during COVID, I think that the message was changing so much. It was so much information. It was very quickly changing for good reasons. We were learning more, and the science was developing, and we were getting more information. But it is not necessarily at the forefront of the way that the majority of our community members think about things. They see this as a reason to mistrust, the reason why there's something fishy about it. Why is this today this way and tomorrow another way? So I think that one way that we can move forward is to just keep in the back of our minds that sometimes mistrust is not irrational, but we need to find better ways to communicate with each other. So I think that the theme of the answers here, the way that I'm seeing it, is just being better communicators and being mindful of that.
Well, I've got you. How are we doing on vaccines in Allegheny County?
Oh yeah, thank you for that question. So I think that Allegheny County as a whole is doing really good compared with other communities. Surely we have certain areas in certain communities that are more likely to seek an exemption for vaccines. But I think that overall for childhood immunizations, we're about 95%, 95.5% fully vaccinated. Different vaccines have slightly higher rates. If we're talking about MMR, measles, I know that measles is on everybody's minds right now. We're doing, again, fairly well, about 96% vaccinations. So we're, with these rates of vaccinations, we are protecting the rest of the community. So right now, we do not have any measles cases in Allegheny County. We don't have any measles cases around Allegheny County, but the Public Health Department has started preparations for any type of response if we need to, vaccination testing, collaborating with our federally qualified health centers, with our pediatricians. We do monthly calls with other providers. But I think that overall we're doing fairly well. But we still have those exemptions, and Pennsylvania coming here from North Carolina to Pennsylvania, I did have to learn about the philosophical exemption, which is not something that exists in North Carolina. So the medical exemption is very, let's say, clear and to the point. You have to have a medical professional that is giving you that exemption based on some type of allergy, organ donation, immunocompromised situation. You have your standard religious exemption, let's say, which I was, again, very familiar with. But the philosophical exemption was something that exists in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania is one of the pretty small number of states that still maintain this philosophical exemption. So it's just great to see that Allegheny County is doing really well with vaccinations. And for us, from the health department's perspective, we want to continue to maintain these levels and encourage vaccinations.
So what I think we've done here is that I've tried to focus it on how these experts personally think about this. It's not just about the science, but I wanted to evoke from them how they make decisions themselves. And the question is, how do we communicate that to the community, to the broader group of anti-skeptics? So we need the facts, of course, but how do we tell it, and how do we communicate our own feelings in doing that? And I appreciate the panel doing a wonderful job in doing that. And so with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Don, and thank you, everybody else, and thanks for being here. I hope that tomorrow each of us can remember that because of Council Member Macy and his colleagues, it will be Jonas Salk Day in Allegheny County. And what happened here 70 years ago is a compelling example of the wonderful things that can be done for the benefit of many when talented, creative, committed people who care about each other join together to advance the common good. And may we all continue to be inspired in all we do by this powerful example. Thanks again for being here.